So yeah, I'm Stephen Cook. I want to talk to you guys today about React Router and specifically adding in animations on your React Router transitions. So first of all, I know React Router. It's like routing is one of the drier things you can talk about in front end type things. And I know animations as well is one of the things where when a designer asks you to introduce animations into a feature you just finished, your heart sinks a little bit. But I promise it's talking about both things at the same time. It is more interesting than all that. And yeah, if I've not convinced you, buckle up because it's 30 minutes of this to go. So yeah, my name's Stephen Cook, as I said. You can find me on Twitter at StephenCookDev. I work at a company called Onfido. We're automating identity verification. So you may have seen us if you signed up on Revolut when you've had to take a picture of your like a driving license or a passport and then a picture of yourself. So that whole bit was us. We use like machine learning and stuff to try and really quickly work out that that's definitely you, that matches the document, and you're allowed a bank account with Revolut basically. So yeah, any questions during the talk, just ping me on at Twitter or at the end of the talk. With all that, let's just dive right in. So can everyone at the back see the code okay? Yeah, cool. So let's just quickly talk about what our end goal is here. So this talk is going to be tied down to React and more specifically React Router, but the concepts here should be hopefully transferable to most front-end routing frameworks. So the code here is basically just a very simple example of how you'd have a switch, switching between different views. So you see the top component here, which is a switch component. That basically just means pick one of these things, but only one. Like the first thing that matches here, just show that. So you see then we have these root components where we're saying, the first one, for example, says its path is /box/a. And then you see in the URL bar, we're on /box/a, so we show that component. We're showing the a box. And then if we transition through, now the URL is B, we're showing the B box, and C is the C box. So that's just yeah, how React Router works. It's a very simple example. What we want is to be able to, without really changing our code, so we're still basically doing the same thing, but rather than just a switch, we want to just say like switch, but with a slide animation or something. That's the code that we want, and we want that to be able to just work. We don't have to change our code at all on top of that. Similarly, like as well, like back transitions going backwards, forward transitions going forwards. So that's our end goal. And just before we get into how we're going to get there, let's just quickly dive into why. Like, why is this something that we should bother doing? The first thing I want to talk about is cognitive load. So this is more of the UX side of things. And then the other one is the swish factor. So like, just how nice things look. So cognitive load is this idea in psychology that you only have so many units of processing power, basically, that you can spend on tasks. So this means if you're trying to do a task that's of moderate difficulty, most of the time, that's fine. You can do that, right? No problem. But if you start to add lots of small tasks that eventually all pile up, that moderate task that you initially, you could do no issue, suddenly this is something where you start to become frustrated with that task or entirely can't do it at all. So this links into routing and animations because those small tasks are basically the main task that you want your users to do, right, is be able to interact with your pages. And every time that you suddenly change what's viewing, your user has to suddenly think, what's happened? Where have I gone forward a page? Have I gone back a page? What's happened? And just as a super contrived example, I'm just going to go through. So this is going to be a few pages where it's going to go through in a sequence of, so this is the first page, and it goes forward to this second page. I'm basically just going to go through them, and I just want you guys to shout out if you think we've gone forwards or backwards a page. So we start off here, we go forwards a page, and then forwards or backwards? Backwards. Cool. So that one was forwards, we hadn't seen the 33893 one before. And then again, cool, so that one is forwards. It's very similar to a number that was back. And then lastly, that one is backwards. Cool, so Obviously, this is a super contrived example, right? Like, you're not showing this sort of thing to your users. Or I really hope you're not. But like the point I'm trying to get to, right, is that on each of these transitions, you're having to perform a check in your mind to say, is this something I have seen before? And normally, like when you're showing content to your users, like you'll be able, they'll be able to do that same check, but a bit easier, right? Because the content will be very visually different. But maybe not all the time. Maybe, you know, how visually different they are depends on what sort of site you're doing. But each transition, even if it's a very simple one, it's still a tiny bit of cognitive load. They're having to think each time, oh, I think that was a forward transition. Conversely, if we're adding animations in, right? If I'm saying that's forwards a page, backwards a page, like I don't need to ask any of you guys, like, was that forwards or backwards, right? Like, you can see it, you can understand the motion. And like, yes, your brain's obviously still doing stuff, like this is still adding to cognitive load, but humans just understand movement on like such a primitive level, right? Like, this is something that we need as cavemen, like understanding if something jumps into a cave and then suddenly this black shadow jumps out, it's probably the same thing. And like, you know, if it was something that we want to run away from, we should probably be running away at that point. That's cognitive load. And then the next point is the swish factor. So this is just, you know, animations look nice, and that's fine. Like, we don't need to argue much further than that, right? There's no reason, as long as it's not breaking the bank, you know, as long as we're not really trying to get this thing to work, there's no reason why we shouldn't just give our users something nice to look at. We like to think that, you know, users are going to be very logical and only pick the product that has all the best features, but obviously people aren't like that. People do just like to look at nice things, and yeah. Only point on that is that we need to moderate this, right? Like, animations are great, but animations that are too long, too flamboyant, or you know, just even doing them too frequently when along core paths where users are trying to do something quickly, very quickly your user's just going to get super frustrated. So hopefully by the end of this talk, everyone will be able to fairly easily, if using React Router, add in these animations. But just because you can do something easily, yeah, it doesn't mean you should. So yeah, just a point of, before we get too far into it, don't do any super flamboyant animations. They're annoying. That gag took me far too long to prepare. But yeah, so what's the problem here, right? So we actually we saw this problem at Onfido because we were trying to add in, on one of our sign-in pages, we had 2 different pages that we wanted to swap between during the sign-in flow. And because this was the sign-in flow and we really didn't want the user to get confused about what was happening during such an important flow, we wanted to be able to animate, like we wanted to slide between those 2 things. And when we initially did this, we did it with animations. We just added in a simple animation that we started when I clicked one button, and then when I clicked back, it went back with doing the animation in reverse. And that was fine, it worked. But what we saw is, like, as soon as this went out for acceptance testing, what everyone did is they'd go into the first bit, they'd hit the button, it would take them to the next page, and then they'd think, cool, right, I want to go back to the previous page. So they'd click the back button in the browser, and obviously they just go back to a completely separate page because animations don't have any integration with the history API. Like, they're not integrated with the history stack. And we could hack that integration in, right? Like, we could just manually push to the history stack and listen for whenever we're popping from the history stack. And that would work, but it'd be really hacky. We'd have our normal React Router code over, like, for most of our transitions. And then we'll have this extra bit where we're saying, oh, but whenever we want to animate it, we have to do this extra weird way. It would get really horrible really quickly. So we didn't want to do that. But looking at React Router itself, React Router is really hard because it doesn't give you any way to hold on to an element when it's removed. React Router, as soon as your route changes, it's gone. Like, what was the previous route? All those views, like they're gone. You don't have any time to say, oh wait, I want it to fade out. React Router is like, no, that's gone. So we need some way to marry these 2 things together. And if we look at the React Router documentation, this is the code that they say to use. This is how they suggest that you get animations going in with React Router. And this works, right? So this, you see on the right, we're going back and forth. We're just fading between these 2 things. And that's great. So let's just break down, like, how is this working? So the first thing we have is this root render location. This doesn't do anything, like don't worry about it. It's literally just a really cheap way to get hold of the location object. So you just have that access to that variable now. The next thing we have is this transition group, which I'll get right back to, but just ignore it for now. And then we have this CSS transition. So CSS transition is from this library called React Transition Group. And basically what it does is, if we pass it a class name, so we're saying class name's fade. If we then pass it a prop that says in equals true to the CSS transition, then what it will do is it will apply to a container around that. It will apply the CSS fade-in-prepare, and then immediately afterwards apply the class name fade-in. So that lets us prepare our animation to do the fade in, and then actually do the fade in once that preparation style has applied. Similarly, if we then change the in equals true prop to in equals false, it will do fade-out-prepare and fade-out. So that is how CSS transition works to actually, fade these things in and out. You'll notice that it doesn't have an in prop. We're not doing that here. And the reason why is because transition group is actually handling that. And again, we'll get back to that in a moment. But now let's just look at the inner code. So we have the switch and our two roots. So that's exactly like how we normally do routing, right? The only difference is we're passing in the location specifically to the switch. The reason for this is because, as it turns out, what transition group actually does, when it runs, it holds on to its previous children. So we actually end up having two switch components on the stage at the same time, one being the old one that we used to have and one being the new one. So we have to hard code the location into the switch so that when it's the old switch that's there, it's still using the old location rather than the new current location. So transition group, as I just sort of alluded to, it basically what it does is it just keeps rendering its old children. It's this really simple idea, but also a really clever idea, right? Of normally in a React, you render your children by saying this.props.children, and then that just renders out all of your children components. Instead, what transition group does is it just says, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to render my children. Instead, I'm going to store my children in my own state, and then I'm going to render my children from that state that I have. This way, when the this.props.children changes, it can just keep rendering the old one and then rendering the new one whenever it wants. Similarly, it also handles setting that in prop on the CSS transition component. So it can say anything that's new, set that to in equals true, anything that's old, set that to in equals false, and then when it's removed, remove it. So that sounds like that's everything, right? And this is the approach that we went for. Like, we followed the React Router documentation, and it was, it's a really useful library. Unfortunately, it turns out there are a couple of issues. A couple. So the first one is that transition group actually animates all of its nodes quite dumbly. And by dumbly, I mean, so hopefully this should demonstrate it. This example here should just, when there's a transition, it fades one out, fades the other one in, but does them on top of each other just so you can see what's happening. If I were to render back twice quickly now, you see we actually render all three things at the same time. So the reason for this is that transition group doesn't know that the context that we're applying it in is that we want to transition between two different pages. It doesn't know that. All it knows is it's been asked to, when something comes in, fade it in, and when something leaves, fade it out. And that's all it's doing. If it gets multiple children at the same time, it just renders all of them. And that might be fine for like the animation that you're going for, but for some animations, that's really going to trip you over. And the next issue is that there's no way to link between the animations. So say you're moving from page A to page B, and you want to animate out page A, and then once that's done, animate in page B. Transition group doesn't give you any way to say, start the other animation once that one's finished. You can fake it, right? Like you could just say, oh, like keep B there the whole time and just wait until such a time where I happen to know that the first one would have finished and then go. And that will work. It has a couple of issues though, right? Like the first issue is that there's no semantic link between this. You don't have any semantic link that's saying these two things are linked. You just have this variable, and like you can try and make that as clean as you want, but it's not really there. The next issue is that, what was the next issue? So yeah, the next issue is that B is on the stage the whole time. So even though we're saying we're not rendering B, that's because we're hiding it in our CSS, right? We're just saying, oh, it's opacity 0, it's displays none, whatever. It's really hard to, just with two CSS transitions, because that's all the CSS transition gives you, it just gives you a prepare state and a go state. So getting B to be on the stage in a way that is not interfering with the animation of A, but also in a state where as soon as it gets its next class change, that it does its animation without issue, that's really fiddly, or at least in the use case that we were trying to get it to work in, that slide animation, very fiddly to make that work. But both of these as well, right? These are just symptoms of the fact that transition group is very hard to customize. Transition group is designed for having a list of items and being able to animate in when we're adding something to that list and animating out when we're moving to that list, which is great, is really good in that context, but outside of that context, in our specific case of routing, it's really just not designed for it. So where do we go from here, right? Like transition group was so close, it was almost what we were going for, but it just fell slightly short. But also remember, like what we were saying, that it's doing, it's a really clever idea, but it's also a very simple idea. It's just storing its children in props. Like we can do that. And that's what this code does. So this code is specifically making a slide transition whenever its children changes. So whenever a child changes, it will animate over one to the left and then bring the other one in from the right. I'm just going to go through each part of this code very quickly. So can everyone read this code at the back? Yeah? Cool. So this is the render function. The render function in React basically is the part that says, I want this to go to the browser. All the other methods in the component generally handle the data. The render method is saying, I want to output this. So what we have is this slider component. I'm not going to go into the code of the slider component, but it's a very simple component. It just takes this position, and it takes positions like from center, and what that will do is from center, it will start in the center. If you said to left, it would start from the center and animate out to the left. And then the only other thing it takes is animation callback, which says after you finish that animation, just trigger this function. So it's super simple. It just takes a few props and applies the correct CSS classes. All of these codes are going to be up online afterwards if anyone's curious and actually wants to look through, but as I say, it's pretty simple. It's just doing animation. The only key bit of interest here is where we're rendering. Where normally here in React we'd say this.props.children because we want to slide our children. Instead what we're saying is render this.state.previouschild or this.state.currentchild. So what this means is when we've moved from A to B, A would be our previous child because that's the page we used to be on. But until we're finished, we want to keep rendering that and we don't want to render our new page. So that's all this bit's saying. So the next bit is this code, which is the component did update function. So this is basically whenever our component's updated, this function will get called. And specifically what we're interested in is has the children prop changed? Has the page changed? So that's what the first few lines are doing, and that if statement, that's basically just checking, has the page changed? If so, we want to set some new state. The state it sets is, okay, set the child position to left. So that's going to start changing what we're rendering, and it's going to start moving it over to the left. It's then going to update the current child and the previous child so that they're at the correct values. So it's going to say, okay, what used to be my current child, that's now my previous child, and the new child I'm being given, that's my new current child. And the only other thing it does is it sets this animation callback to this.swapChildren. So basically when we're moving to the left, as soon as we get there, we're going to call this.swapChildren, which this.swapChildren just says, okay, set the child position to from right. So we were going to the left, and when we say from right, it will suddenly jump to the right-hand side and start moving into the center. That's what that child position means. And then we just clear our previous child. So that's going to, so we were rendering A because that was our previous child, rendering over to the left. Suddenly we call swap children. That's going to change A to B. So now B is over here because of the from right. And then that goes into the center. And that was everything. Like, that's all that's in this class. There's the constructor as well, but that's just initializing the state. That's everything you need to get this behavior we're talking about sliding out whenever the children change. There's this extra bit of code as well. This is just a higher order component that basically takes that component we just were talking about, which is that component we were just talking about was sliding out whenever the child changed. So this just makes it so that it hooks into React Router quite well. So it's doing very similar to like what if you cast your mind back to the transition group solution we saw, this is basically doing a very similar thing. It's got the root render location, just so we have a hold of the location. And then we say that we'll take our switch component, so we can pass in any switch component. This is generally going to be the switch component from React Router. And we're going to use our animated component, which is like, it's basically doing what the transition group and the CSS transition were doing. And then it has inside the custom switch, and then the children, which is going to be all of your roots. And this is everything we actually need. And just to quickly show as well, I can go through. So this, can everyone see the code at the back? Cool. So this is, yeah, just a very simple React Router thing, fully complete, but basically it's just a load of links that change the page, and whenever the page changes, it's a new link, just showing some different animals. So what we want is for this, which at the moment is just using this normal switch, we want this to be using our new component. So we can just quickly grab those code samples that we just had up. And then if we copy that in, then hopefully just changing the switch to the new switch of slide. Cool, so that's got us the switch of slide variable. We just need to actually use it now. Cool, so now, fingers crossed, whenever I change the root, this is going to do the exact same thing, but with the slide animation, which is what it's doing. And just to make sure that everyone is following the actual steps involved here, we can quickly slow everything down and just, so first of all, if we get rid of the overflow hidden, so basically this means rather than when it's sliding, we don't see it anymore, we'll always be able to see what's actually there. And we can also, in our slider component, just change the transition length to 20 seconds. So now, you see we've clicked, this has caused the root to change. So this is causing us to render to left, and that is going, it set the animation callback for swap children, and then when it gets there, there you go, it triggers, and that's called swap children. That's got rid of the previous child. It's set it to from right, so you see it suddenly jumps to the other side, comes in, finishing the other animation, and then once it gets there, it's done. It will, everything else is done right. It's already cleared its previous child, it's got nothing else to do, and that's the whole thing. So just to recap, our end goal was to be able to go from our normal React Router code, going ABC, to adding in just this switch with slide thing, which is what we created. Like that code we all saw, that was a switch with slides, and that got us going through ABC. There's one little bit I missed off, which is the backwards animation. I didn't tell you guys how to do backwards animation. It's super simple. It's really you just pass in an order for it to run through of what route you want to be in, and then depending on which way you've gone, you basically just need to determine, okay, should I be going to left or should I be going to right? The reason I skipped it out is because it basically, at every step, it just adds in this if statement that just makes it a bit harder to follow. But yeah, I'm sure you guys could work it out yourselves from here. But if not, again, all this code's up online, so you can just take a look. But yeah, go forth and animate. Hopefully this is taught you guys how, hopefully this is, yeah, made it seem simple. Again, yeah, any questions though, I'm at Stephen Cook Dev on Twitter, and it's only fair to mention all of this was basically done on Onfido's time. So yeah, Onfido is hiring. If anyone's looking for a new opportunity, yeah, we're hiring for engineers, specifically front-end engineers. So yeah, please do get in touch if you're interested. But otherwise, yeah, thank you guys for listening.